What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and just this week, a bunch of spoilers were released for the new Blood Angels Codex coming out for Warhammer 40,000. So, let's talk about them. All these spoilers just were released on Imgur earlier this week and prophesy some interesting changes to the Blood Angels faction. Now, as far as I know, what we don't have are data sheets for the faction. We just have stratagems, detachment abilities, warlord traits, and stuff like that. So the jury's still out on how much the individual data sheets for the faction are going to change. Given the level of changes that we've seen in previous codexes, or specifically the Space Wolves Codex and the Deathwatch Codex, I think we can expect some minor changes to the datasheets, but they will remain mostly unchanged out of the index. Moving on, we have some special secondary objectives for the Blood Angels. Now, keep in mind, just like we talked about with the Deathwatch secondaries, these can actually be taken alongside the Space Marine secondaries. The way that your chapter-approved secondaries work for individual codex secondaries is that you can only select one from each list of specific secondaries, as long as your detachments meet the requirements of bringing that secondary. So, for example, if I have a Blood Angels detachment, that opens me up to being able to take the Blood Angels secondary objectives, and I can select one secondary objective from this list. And in addition, because a Blood Angels detachment is also already a Space Marine detachment, I can also then take one secondary objective from the Space Marine list. So Blood Angels armies will have two lists of army-specific secondaries that they're able to take, and this is one of the lists. First off, we have Blade of Sanguinius. It's a challenge secondary. You pick one of your characters, and you basically have to go kill one of your opponent's characters, a specific one of your opponent's characters with that character, and you'll get additional VPs for how well you do that. I think the Space Wolves have one almost identical to this, if I remember correctly. These secondaries are garbage. There's no impetus for your opponent to select one of their frontline characters, and they can just take their character that's going to be hiding in the back of the table, and that, I mean, you'll have to table them to kill anyway. So the times that I've had this played against me, I'm playing Tyranids or something like that, they'll issue a challenge with one of their big beatstick characters, and I'll accept it with like a Neurothrope who's going to stand on my table edge the entire time, and there's no way that they're going to score more than 5 points ever off the secondary. Just terrible. I don't think I'd ever take that one. Fury of the Lost scores you 3 victory points each round. A Death Company unit destroys an enemy unit. That's not that good. Usually Death Company are sort of a one-shot wonder. They'll go in, they'll Forlorn Fury and hit super hard and punch the crap out of some people, and then they all die. So this requires you to have Death Company units killing your opponent's army throughout the entire game, and that's just not how Blood Angels function, so I don't think that's particularly solid. Death from Above is sort of similar. It gives you victory points if your units coming in from reserve destroy enemies. This is sort of bafflingly bad. From the get-go, you can only ever have 2 reinforcement steps be active during the game. So this is going to score maybe 6 points if you're just using standard reinforcement rules. Now, there are several ways to pick units up off the table and redeploy them during the reinforcement step. We'll talk about a couple of those in the stratagem section, but also like the Terminators can just do that by themselves if they take a teleport homer. And there's a couple other ways to do it. So, like, you could potentially have 4 active reinforcement steps throughout the course of the game, but that means that you're going to constantly having to cycle your units off the table and then bring them back on, and you could only score a maximum of 12 points from the secondary, and that's if you kill characters every round with the units coming in. I feel like maybe this was supposed to be 2 victory points per unit that was destroyed or something like that, but instead it's not. It's 2 victory points if 1 or more units were destroyed. So, this is just terrible. I'm not really sure what the idea here was. Lastly, we have Relentless Assault. This one, I think, is the one out of this list that is probably pretty reasonable. You score 4 victory points at the end of the turn if there are more Blood Angels units, in your enemy deployment zone than there are enemy units in your deployment zone. Now, firstly, this scores at the end of your turn, which is great. It scores for 4 victory points, which is awesome. You only need to score it 4 times in order to max it. 3 times is still fine, and it doesn't require you to be wholly within the enemy deployment zone. You just have to be within. So you just have 1 model out of your unit touching the enemy deployment zone. If your opponent has no units in your deployment zone, which, I mean, let's be honest, they probably won't. at the end of your turn, then you score 4 victory points. Now, this is taking the space of Engage on All Fronts, since it's a Battlefield Supremacy secondary, and I think Blood Angels are probably pretty good at Engage on All Fronts, but it's, I think, maybe a little bit easier to score. You only need to do it 3 times to go score 12 off of that, and that's usually what you're going to be getting around Engage. Engage is usually like a 10-ish point secondary, and this one seems like a pretty easy 12, especially with how aggressive Blood Angels are supposed to be. So I actually think this is a big win for a secondary objective. This is probably one that you're going to see pretty often coming out of aggressive Blood Angels lists. Next up, we have some new rules for the Death Company induction that you did see in 8th edition. It was just a stratagem for 1 CP that added you to the Death Company, and that gave you a 6+ damage ignore as well as +1 attack on the charge. So in this case, giving you the Black Rage and Death Visions ability. We'll have to take a look at Black Rage a little later on, but I believe that's mostly the same. Death Visions has had a huge overhaul. I think Death Visions was actually the name of the stratagem in 8th edition, but it's an entirely new and unique ability to Blood Angels that we'll talk about once we get to the Datasheet Abilities section, but it's actually a pretty interesting one. And in addition, it swaps out the characters that you upgrade so that their aura abilities only affect Death Company units, not your entire army. So captains that are in the Death Company only reroll 1s to hit for Death Company units, and lieutenants reroll 1s to wound for Death Company units. Pretty interesting that they would swap that around. So if you want to get the maximum damage output out of your big smash captains, then you do have to sort of sacrifice their standard rights of battle aura, which is a pretty useful thing to have. A lot of times, it was just nice to have a reroll 1's aura that you could just embed in your army. But now if you want to do that with these captains, they can only affect Death Company units. The other interesting thing that it does is that it makes the captain or lieutenant not count for the max cap that a detachment can have per Codex Space Marines. So normally you can only bring 1 captain per detachment and 2 lieutenants. However, this upgrading these guys to be Death Company allows you to take a standard captain alongside the Death Company captain. So this is the way, if you want to play sort of the character, the hero hammer that Blood Angels are very famous for, this is the way you can get multiple smash captains into your army. Okay, so moving on to stratagems, a lot of huge changes here, and I've pulled up the 8th edition codex that I'm going to be reading alongside, just so we can go over some of the exact changes to these specific stratagems. Some of them have been totally overhauled, and an exemplar of that is the first one on the list, Descent of Angels. This one is totally different. Previously it gave you a 3d6 charge if you came out of Deep Strike that turn, and now you ignore modifiers to the charge roll, and you get +1 to hit when you get in. Super weird, to be honest, because you use it during your movement phase and it only affects the charge and fight phases, and it's not that big of a deal. +1 to hit in melee, I mean, it's good. You'd like to have that, but sort of strange that it's a movement phase ability and not something that you do when you charge with a jump pack unit or something like that. Vengeance for Sanguinius gives you rerolls against Black Legion units. Probably not that relevant. Refusal to Die is just the upgrade of the old Death Company ability to upgrade their damage ignore to 5+. That's basically exactly the same, except that it costs only 1 CP if you are 5 or fewer models. So that'll be useful for those captains and stuff that they're eating damage on them, because they're going to be a single model unit, and you can give them a 5+ damage ignore, especially if you're bringing like a Primaris captain who's coming in at like 6 or 7 wounds. A 5+ damage ignore for 1 CP on that guy is really good. Whether or not you can actually deliver that guy to combat, that's another question, but you can make those guys pretty difficult to kill. But otherwise, it's a 2 CP strat for the larger units, and I think that's fine, especially given the upgrades to 2 wounds each for those for Space Marine infantry. 2 wounds each with a 5+ damage ignore is pretty difficult to get through on any day, especially if you're like a 2 damage weapon, and a lot of times that attack is going to be almost entirely negated by 1 5+ rolled on 2 dice, which is pretty mathematically easy to get to. So that's pretty good defensive stat line. Aggressive Onslaught is a Flesh Terrors specific stratagem, gives you a 6-inch pile in or consolidate rather than a 3-inch. That's very nice, especially if you're wanting to get deep into your opponent's army, get some wraps off. Angel's Sacrifice selects a character unit and forces enemies within engagement range of that unit to target it with their attacks. That's actually probably pretty reasonable, especially sort of in conjunction with that Refusal to Die. If you have a particularly tanky character in melee, you can, you've got a Storm Shield going on, maybe you've got some Terminator armor, some defensive buffs active, and you can if your opponent has like one big smash character that mathematically has a tough time killing you, you can force them, instead of knocking off like 3 or 4 Sanguinary Guard, you can force them to attack your character and hopefully tank through it on invulnerable saves. So I actually think that's a stratagem that's going to catch a lot of people off guard. Spiritual Might lets you cast an additional time with a Psyker. Awesome. A lot of factions have abilities like this. And as we'll talk about in a sec, the Sanguinary Discipline basically hasn't changed from what it was in 8th edition, which was already very good. So having additional casts available to you is going to be pretty useful. Visions of Sanguinius gives you an additional use of the Death Visions ability, which we'll talk about. So you can double stack 2 of them together if you really want to. We'll talk about whether that's worth it in a sec here. Lucifer Pattern Engines has seen some changes. It used to give you an additional 6 inches on an advance for a Ball Predator, and then just made any advance for a Blood Angel's vehicle flat 6 inches. Now it just makes you flat 6 inches. So I don't know if there's any specific synergy with the Ball Predators now. It looks like there's probably not. But it can get you up the table a little bit more quickly. Probably pretty useful if you're trying to deliver impulsors, which I think Blood Angels will be doing a lot of times. So moving those guys 20 inches up the table for 1 CP is pretty solid. Red Rampage has actually totally been reworked. That used to give you D3 additional attacks for a Blood Angels character when they got into melee. Part of the problem with that in 8th edition is that you could stack it with a bunch of additional buffs on top of that character. You know, if they were a Death Company guy, they're already getting +1. You could potentially, have them be quickened for an extra D3, use the Red Rampage for another D3, and then double fight to double the number of attacks that you made in that fight phase, or fight when you die at the end. And it just got ridiculous. Now, instead, what it does is it gives you effectively a rending ability, but only while the Assault Doctrine is active. Unbridled Ardor, big change here. It affects only Sanguinary Guard now instead of everything in this Blood Angels Codex. That's a huge deal. But you could catch people off guard by intervening scouts into them and blocking them in, or getting 6-inch intervenes off characters. The fact that only Sanguinary Guard can do it now, that's a real big deal, and especially now that you cannot intervene while you are engaged in melee yourself, so you can shut that ability off pretty quickly. That's actually going to make playing against the Blood Angels a lot easier, because that was one of the grossest abilities that they had. Forlorn Fury, I don't believe this has changed too much. Before the first battle round, a Death Company unit can move up to 12 inches, as long as it stays 9 inches away from enemy models. And it now only costs 1 CP if you have a unit of 5 or less models. Obviously, a great ability to rocket in Death Company immediately, or put them in defensive positions in this, up in the center of the table where they can take a charge, or set up for a turn 2 charge. Redeploy abilities like this are always going to be amazing, and this one's even better because it allows you to get additional threat range out of that unit if you do go first. So, plus you get to use this once you know who's going first, so you can react to that. Pretty good that hasn't changed, because it does give Death Company sort of their identity as just a reckless assault unit running across the table. Upon Wings of Fire, big change here. What this did in 8th edition was pick a unit off the table and deep strike it immediately. So you could essentially be deep striking on the top of turn 1 into your opponent's army for a couple CP. Which was really powerful, especially since you could then use the old Descent of Angels to get a 3d6 charge, use a Chaplain Aura to get +2 to that, and you could basically guarantee a charge anywhere on the table on turn 1 with whatever jump pack unit you want. Now, unfortunately, you pick that unit up off the table and you deep strike them in the reinforcement step of the next movement phase. So you're going to not have use of that unit for the entire round, and they're going to pop in later. So not super useful anymore. This is one of the ways that you can re-deep strike units that I was just talking about previously when we were talking about the secondary objectives. And unfortunately, you cannot do this one on turn 1, so that's another turn that you cannot then use that secondary to deep strike models in and kill enemies with. Because you even if you do it at the top of turn 1, you do have to deep strike them then on turn 2. Not super useful, honestly. I mean, there's going to be some point where it's going to be really clutch, but for the most part, this is mostly going to be a pretty situational secondary and not one that you build your game plan around, unlike it was in the previous edition. Savage Destruction gives you an additional penalty on combat attrition tests for units taking morale tests while engaging range of Flesh Terrors units. Probably not gonna be that super useful. Pretty good if you can force a random attrition test on like a big unit of Orc Boys or something and try to make a bunch of them run away. But you're rarely gonna wipe a unit out with this. and the enemy unit has to already be in engagement range during the morale phase with you, which is not often that's going to happen. And a lot of times, if they are in engagement range, you don't want them to run away because you want them to stay in melee. And if they're able to pull casualties from morale out of melee, then they just get to shoot you. So probably, almost all morale effects in the game are not super useful, and this one doesn't really break that trend. Chalice Overflowing allows the Sanguinary Priest to use its Blood Chalice ability a second time during your command phase. Now, currently in the Index rules, and I don't really see a reason that this would change very much, the Blood Chalice allows you to set a unit into Assault Doctrine within 6 inches of that Sanguinary Priest. Because this happens in the command phase, it's actually pretty useful because you can start those units within 6 inches of that character, then set them into Assault Doctrine, get all the benefits for that, and then rocket them out wherever they want to be going. So this is probably pretty useful in round 1 or 2 when your unit is still relatively compact but wants to immediately spread out from there and start hammering your opponent down. And it lets you set 2 units back into Assault Doctrine. Moving down to Warlord Traits, Speed of the Primarch hasn't really changed. You get to fight first in the fight phase. Artisan of War now gives you a special issue war gear instead of adding 1 to the damage of one of your weapons. I mean, usually you would just take a mastercrafted weapon anyway, but what the change that this does is it gives you a little bit of flexibility. You can take another special issue war gear if you want, but if you take that mastercrafted weapon, you cannot then have another mastercrafted weapon somewhere else in the detachment. So it does restrict the number of 4 damage Thunderhammers that you can be bringing around, but it does potentially give you access to 2 effective relics, which is pretty interesting. Not every faction can do that. Soul Warden gives you like a permanent Litany of Faith. It gives you a 5+ damage ignore against mortal wounds. That's pretty matchup dependent. And given the way things are going and requiring lists to be set before you get to the game with no pre-game selections available, I think that's basically useless, which sucks. So just write that one right off. Heroic Bearing gives you 3 inches to the range of most of your aura abilities, which is pretty cool. It also gives you +1 leadership within 9 inches of the Warlord, basically giving you access to the Ultramarine Warlord trait that does the same thing. So pretty useful, especially with abilities like Chapter Master or Captain Aura. Much better for support characters. It's going to be interesting to see if it sees you play in Blood Angels because your characters tend to be focused on damage output rather than supporting your army. Gift of Foresight gives you kind of a Victor of the Blood games reroll every turn. 1 hit roll, wound roll, or saving throw for the Warlord. These Warlord traits tend to be extremely powerful and often overlooked. They're not super good on sort of mid-range characters or mid-weight characters, I guess, kind of like Space Marine captains. You usually see them on big stuff like, Dreadnoughts or Custodes Bite captains that have 1 billion wounds and a 3+ invulnerable save and stuff like that, where they become super duper oppressive. But I think they are still worthwhile. And you could potentially, you could put it on a Dreadnought. I guess you have Librarian Dreadnoughts available to you. So I do think that this is probably going to be a Warlord trait that sees some play. Selfless Valor gives you a 6-inch heroic intervention, just like it did in the previous version. Those are nice to have, but I don't think you see too many uses of them. Flesh Terrors also got some specific Warlord traits as well. Merciless Butcher gives you additional attacks for every 5 enemy models within 3 inches. Yeah. Wrath and Rage gives you exploding 6s to hit, but again, unless you're like a Teeth of Terror captain, you're not making that many attacks to start with, so the exploding 6s aren't super good. And lastly, Cretation Born gives you reroll charges, and your opponents can't fire Overwatch against you. Basically, the Raven Guard Jump Pack relic, except in a Warlord trait. That seems fine, but again, it's not super flashy. The Sanguinary Discipline, like I mentioned before, hasn't really changed from 8th edition. Quickening gives you a reroll advances and charges, and an additional D3 attacks to the Psyker's attacks characteristic. Unleash Rage has changed a little bit. It used to give you +1 attack, but now it gives you exploding 6s on a core unit within 12. So a little bit less damage output, but still fairly good if you want to be supporting a big unit like Sanguinary Guard that are going to be attacking 1 billion times. Shield of Sanguinius gives something within 18 inches, a 5+ invulnerable save. I think this is actually pretty interesting if you combo it with a standard librarian using the standard discipline, because you can have Psychic Fortress to give that guy an aura of a 5+ invulnerable save and then use the Shield of Sanguinius on something else, and you can sort of spam a 5+ invulnerable save off across the vast majority of your army, which is actually a pretty interesting way to go. If you're not taking a lot of Storm Shields on stuff, Blood Angels tend to be a little bit weak to high AP stuff, given especially that like Sanguinary Guard don't typically have any invulnerable save, so having access to that is pretty nice. And it may be that you want a standard Librarius Discipline librarian in your army anyway, because Might of Heroes is really good for Blood Angels. Blood Boil is a a targeted smite that can deal mortal wounds depending on the roll of a 2d6. If you beat the toughness characteristic of models in the unit, they take d3, and if you double it, they take 3. So normally, if you're hitting like a toughness 4 character, you just need to roll a 5+ to deal d3 mortal wounds, and you need to roll an 8 to deal 3 mortal wounds, a flat 3 mortal wounds. So a little bit less reliable than a standard smite, but with a little bit higher upside since you can do that flat 3 mortals. Blood Lance is almost as useless as it has been in the past. You shoot a line 18 inches between you and a target unit, and on a 5+, everything you pass over takes a mortal wound. So you have to be hitting like a whole boatload of models for this to be better than a regular smite. You know, you have to be hitting probably 6 models for this to be better than a normal smite, and the times that that's going to happen are relatively inconsistent. And this is taking up one of your psychic power slots, so normally you won't be taking this. And lastly, the big headliner, Wings of Sanguinius, has changed a little bit. Previously, it gave you a movement characteristic of 12 and fly until your next psychic phase, which meant that it also affected you during your next movement phase. Now it just gives you that 12-inch move characteristic and then moves you immediately, and then the 12-inch move expires. So you get one big 12-inch fly around, and then you're done there. Not that like a huge change. I think it was mostly kind of gimmicky that you would get the additional 6 inches of movement on the next turn anyway, and having it just be one 12-inch movement as soon as you cast it is, usually that's the use case anyway, is to get an additional 12 inches of movement on a big beat stick psyker character. So I honestly don't think the change is going to make that big of a deal, but it has been nerfed a little bit. Moving over to Relics, I'll mostly skip on over these. I'm not going to go into each one individually. So if there's some specific combinations or super powerful ones that I miss over, I do apologize. We have the Hammer of Ball returning, a Thunder Hammer that doesn't have -1 to hit. It does have the new Thunder Hammer stat line, it looks like, so AP2 instead of AP3, but that's a small price to pay for having a no penalty Thunder Hammer, which is pretty good. Icon of the Angel, looks like that hasn't changed too much, gives you rerolls to charges for Blood Angels units within 6. Wrath of Ball gives you +2 inches of movement for jump pack units that move, advance, or fall back within 6 inches of it. Incredible. So if you can start stacking those on top of each other, you can really get some insane threat ranges out of there. Visage of Death is a really interesting one. Gives you -1 to hit the wearer, and anybody within 3 inches loses objective secured, which is really cool. That's probably going to be pretty useful a lot of times, especially since Blood Angels are going to be trying to take objectives with non-trooper models a lot. They're going to be running Sanguinary Guard and Vanguard veterans and stuff like that, which do not have OBSEC themselves, onto objectives, and this just means that you don't have to take Rites of Battle in order to get yourself that objective secured effect, essentially. So as long as you outnumber your opponent on raw numbers, which a lot of times you will, if you get a full unit of guys onto an objective, then you can take it away from them. So I think that's actually a pretty an interesting one. Probably going to be a sleeper pick that is going to catch some people off guard. Archangel's Shard is a special issue wargear that replaces a power sword. Gives you +2 strength, AP4 for 2 flat damage. It becomes damage 3 if you hit a chaos unit, damage 4 if you hit a chaos monster. That'll be interesting. It's pretty meta dependent, but if you are playing against a lot of chaos, having a flat 3 damage power sword is pretty good. It's like you're almost getting to a Thunder Hammer, except that you don't have to get the -1 to hit. It's like a high AP Hammer of Ball. Now, coming to the end here, like I said, we don't have data sheets in this particular leak, but we do have the Datasheet Abilities. Black Rage has changed a little bit. You cannot fall back, and you also cannot perform actions. There are a lot of units getting these specific types of abilities coming out of these new codexes, which interact with actions sort of negatively, and I think it's pretty interesting, so that your hardcore melee units are not going to be quite as useful in terms of scoring secondary objectives as your other units may be. So lastly, on the Datasheet Abilities, the Death Visions ability has been totally revamped. This is a brand new, totally unique ability specifically for Blood Angels, and I think it's really interesting, so let's talk about it. Now, it's an ability that triggers at the start of the fight phase when you fight with a model that has this Death Visions ability. There are 3 Death Visions to pick from that trigger at slightly different times, and you can only pick each one once per game. So they're sort of one-use abilities throughout the course of the game. Now, do remember, we do have that stratagem where one model can pick 2 of them. You can't have used either of the Death Visions previously in the battle, but it gives you the opportunity to use 2 visions for a single fight phase. And each one of them gives you some specific buffs. For example, on the Bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, the first one here, it triggers if there are enemy infantry characters or monster characters visible to it. So you just have to see an infantry character in order to trigger this, which is probably pretty easy if you're, ramming yourself directly into your opponent's face. That said, if your opponent doesn't really have many of those infantry characters, it could be a little bit tough to trigger these. For example, biker characters are not affected by this. If it's a vehicle character like a character Dreadnought, that also is not affected by this death vision. So I guess the Blood Angels are pretty picky about which enemies they really want to kill. I mean, they'll let some of them go. As long as you sit on a bicycle, I'm not that mad at you. But this first one, if you do trigger it and there is an enemy infantry or monster character in line of sight, you can elect to use it. It gives you +1 attack for every 5 enemy models within 6 inches, and every time you make an attack, you can reroll the hit roll. Now, honestly, the worst case scenario on this, assuming you can trigger it, is I think that you get once per game you get +1 attack and reroll your hits. And on sort of just at the base level, I think that's really good. There's going to be a lot of situations where only 5 models to get +1 attack within 6 inches of you. 6 inches is a big aura, and I think you're going to be able to do it relatively quickly. Now, there's obviously the upside where you're fighting against orcs or something like that with a big horde units that you want to go smash, and you get +4 attacks from this and reroll all your hit rolls. That suddenly makes a Thunderhammer Smash Captain into an absolute blender. Even though just hitting on 3s, but with full rerolls and rolling 10 attacks or 12 attacks is going to kill a whole boatload of models. So I think that's going to be super useful. Grace of the Angel, another one. This one only triggers if you are actually fighting an infantry character or monster character. You have to have them in engagement range with you, but if you do, you get to select it and get yourself a 3+ invulnerable save for the rest of the fight phase. So that's pretty good. You get old Storm Shields back. Pretty nice. Everybody's excited about that. So that can potentially have you tank one of those big scary characters for an entire round. And again, you can combo that with a stratagem to force your opponent to target your character. Angel Sacrifice, I think, during the fight phase. So you can potentially, if you're engaging, a bunch of enemy models and one of them is a character, you can pop this, you get the 3+ invulnerable save. You can potentially give in addition, give yourself a 5+ damage ignore, become extremely difficult to kill for a round, and then force your opponent to dump all of their attacks into this annoying invulnerable save guy. If you have a Storm Shield as well, you're at a 2+ armor save, so even their random little attacks are probably going to bounce off you. You can make these Blood Angels characters really hard to kill. Lastly, to slay the War Master, probably the least useful of all 3 of these. Again, you have to be engaging an infantry character or monster character, and then instead of attacking, you and your opponent both roll a die. If you win, they take D3 + 3 mortal wounds. Okay. You have to specifically target those mortal wounds into the character that you're engaging. But on the flip side, it's a 50-50 that they take any damage at all. So there are situations where, let's say you're fighting against the Blood Angels character with the 3+ invulnerable save that's forcing you to make all your attacks against them. At that situation, you probably, you probably want to use this. This gives you a pretty high upside on killing a 5-wound character. If you get through that 50-50, then it's a 60%er that you deal 5 mortals and just kill a 5-wound character outright. The downside is you have to get through that 50-50, and there's no dice fixing on this at all. You can't reroll this. You can't reroll your roll. Your opponent can't reroll the roll. So you're just rolling a 4-up, basically, to try to win that roll off. And if you do some mortal wounds, but if you don't, whatever. Given how smashy Blood Angels characters are, you usually just want to make your attacks. You make a billion attacks at 3 damage, and if even 2 of them, 1 or 2 of them get through, you're going to be doing more damage than this ability is. So there might be situations where mathematically it's going to be better, but for the most part, I don't know if they're going to be that often. So, not super good. But again, I don't know. It's there in case you need it. The other two death visions, however, seem incredible. So I think those are going to be super useful. Last page of this particular set of leaks, we have some weapon profiles as well as points values. So not too much that we can glean from these, just besides the fact that I guess these units are being included in the codex and didn't get written off. But we'll have to actually look at their data sheets to see what the specific rules are on them before we can make any final judgments on units specifically. So that's going to be it for this particular spoiler. Hope everybody enjoyed looking at these cool new rules, and I hope people are getting super psyched about the new Blood Angels Codex coming out pretty shortly. These new Space Marine codexes, as much as I hate to, just have more and more Space Marine releases come out, they've been pretty unique and interesting, and they have a lot of very unique abilities in them. I like, specifically, I think the Death Visions are very cool. I think some of the secondary objectives, definitely the secondary objective where you have to get to your opponent's deployment zone, that's probably pretty playable. And I do like that they've toned down sort of, on all of these factions so far, the ridiculous outliers of power level that some of them had. We don't have these basically auto pass, turn 1 deep strike charges onto whatever you want in your opponent's army. And there were some situations in the 8th edition codex where if your opponent went second and didn't have forward deploy screeners, they would just die. Especially like a long table edge deployment where they couldn't deploy backline with their big heavy stuff. Sometimes you would just kill them immediately and there was nothing they could do about it. And I do like that has been mostly removed from the game. Now you have to play a more ground poundy game plan. You have to get your units up the table and fight like a normal person, and I think that's fine. And given how we've seen games be played out in 8th edition, having, those relatively long threat range units that can take the center of the board and then push into your opponent's objectives from there, those are typically pretty effective. And so I do think that this new Blood Angels Codex, while it's not as powerful as it was in the previous version, I do think it's going to be pretty good. It is sad that we're losing a little bit of the super smashy characters. I mean, they were really broken, but I liked them. I liked playing them. I thought they were interesting to play against. They were sort of an interesting sub-game. You had to be able to deal with characters very efficiently in order to beat Blood Angels. But on the flip side, they, killed Warlord Titans and stuff, so that was probably not okay. But giving rules like the Death Visions back into Codex and having the ability to spam multiple captains using the Death Company rules, I think those are an interesting way to bring the flavor of those smashy characters back into the faction without them being super duper overpowered. So anyway, thanks everybody for watching. I really appreciate it. As always, like and subscribe, I guess, if you like the coverage. If you want to support the channel, you can join the patrons at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. We also have a cool little join button, YouTube membership button down below you can join, and that gives you some awesome unique emojis and things like that you can use on the channel. But otherwise, thanks again for watching, everybody. Hope everyone had a good holiday who's in the US. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.